Picture your worst Monday morning. Maybe your boss sent an email at 7 a.m. Maybe the coffee machine broke. Maybe you had to sit through a 3-hour meeting that could have been a text message. Now imagine your Monday morning involves climbing into a pit of human waste with a bucket and a shovel, and you're not allowed to start until 9 p.m. That's one job on today's list. History is full of jobs that needed doing and nobody wanted to do. Roads got built, armies got fed, kings got served. But somewhere in every civilization, someone had the job nobody else would take. The gig nobody put on their apprenticeship application. The role so degrading, so dangerous, or so cosmically unfair that it's a miracle anyone showed up. These are those people. 10 of the worst jobs in human history. All of them real. All of them verified. And one of them, the one that sounds worst of all, turns out to be a twist. Let's get into it. Job number 1. The Roman Urine Collector. Ancient Rome was a civilization of staggering sophistication. Aqueducts. Concrete. A legal system that still echoes in modern law. A network of roads that took 1,000 years to surpass. And a thriving industry built entirely on collecting strangers' urine. Here's how Roman laundry worked. The fullers, the professional launderers of ancient Rome, used urine as their primary cleaning agent. Human urine contains ammonia. Ammonia is a natural bleaching agent and degreaser. It lifted stains, whitened cloth, and cut through the grease and sweat embedded in a Roman toga. So far, so logical. Chemistry is chemistry. The problem, you need a lot of urine, more than any one person produces. So the fullers outsourced collection. Large ceramic amphorae, basically giant jugs, were placed outside inns, apartment blocks, and public buildings throughout Roman cities. People used them. Constantly. This was Rome. Everyone was walking past these jugs all day. The amphorae filled up. Then the urine collectors came to take them away. They loaded the full jugs onto carts, hauled them to the laundry, and poured them into vats. Workers, called foulons, then climbed into the vats and trampled the wet clothes underfoot, stomping up and down, in urine, 4 hours, while wearing the clothes of Roman senators, magistrates, and wealthy merchants. The toga you saw on a consul in the Forum had been soaked in strangers' urine and stomped on by a guy's feet. Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 AD, decided that if this many people were making this much money from urine, the government should get a cut. He taxed the urine trade. His son Titus complained. Apparently even Roman princes had limits. Vespasian held a coin in front of Titus's face and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't smell. It became one of the most famous phrases in Roman history. Vespasian was right, of course. The collectors got paid. The fullers got paid. The senators got clean togas. The empire taxed it all. Nobody asked the guy stomping in the vat how his day was going. Job number 2. The Gong Farmer. The word gong in medieval English meant dung. Put that together. Gong farmers were the men, and it was almost always men, who cleaned out the cesspits beneath medieval castles, manor houses, and town privies. By hand. In the dark, with a shovel and a bucket. The laws around this job were specific and enforced. Gong farmers were not permitted to work between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. They could only work at night. The official reason was the smell. It was so bad that daytime operation was considered a public disturbance. The actual result, Gong farmers lived their entire professional lives in darkness, surrounded by medieval human waste, while the rest of the population slept. They were required to live outside city walls. They couldn't enter most public spaces. They were paid well, significantly better than a standard medieval laborer, because nobody else would do it, and the job genuinely could not be left undone. Medieval cesspits filled up. If you didn't empty them, the castle became uninhabitable. Kings needed gong farmers. Kings just preferred not to think about it. The dangers were real and documented. Methane gas builds up in enclosed pits of decomposing waste. Gong farmers descended into these pits with a candle, which is about as bad an idea as it sounds. Explosions happened. Asphyxiation happened. The work killed people. The most documented incident. In 1326, a gong farmer named Richard the Raker fell through a rotted privy floor and drowned in his own cesspit. That is the sentence. There is nothing to add to it. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years. Someone cleaned those pits for every single one of them. Job number 3. The Egyptian Ripper Man. The ancient Egyptian mummification process is one of the most sophisticated mortuary traditions in human history, developed over thousands of years, refined into ritual, performed by trained specialists following detailed religious protocols. It was also one of the most hierarchically unfair job assignments ever recorded. The process required several roles. The chief embalmer, called the Kurheb, oversaw everything. He was a priest. He wore the mask of Anubis during key rituals. This was a prestigious, sacred role. Then there was the parashist, the Ripper Man. The Ripper Man's job was to make the initial incision, a cut into the left flank of the body, through which the organs would be removed. This was a necessary first step. Without the incision, nothing else could proceed. It was also ritually unclean. The ancient Egyptian belief system drew a sharp line between the act of cutting the body, violating it by definition, and the sacred acts of preparation that followed. Someone had to make that cut. But the moment the cut was made, that person had defiled themselves. So the priests attending the mummification were required, by ritual obligation, to drive the parashistas away the moment he completed the incision. They threw stones at him. They cursed him. Symbolically, formally, as part of the procedure. He made the cut. He was immediately chased off. He stood at a distance while the Kerheb performed the sacred work his incision had made possible. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes this practice in Book 2 of his histories. The stone throwing wasn't optional or informal. It was written into the procedure. The Ripper Man absorbed the defilement so the priests didn't have to. He was paid. He was then restricted from entering certain temple precincts. He was essential, and he was punished for being essential every single time. He did it anyway. Job number 4. The Leech Collector. In the early 19th century, leeches were medical gold. Bloodletting, the practice of removing blood to treat illness, had been a cornerstone of Western medicine for over 2,000 years. And leeches were the clean, efficient, socially acceptable version of the practice. A doctor could apply leeches to a patient, leave the room, come back, remove them. No knives, no mess, no drama. Demand exploded. France alone imported 41.5 million leeches in a single year, 1,833. England was consuming tens of millions annually. Hospitals maintained leech jars. Private physicians kept personal supplies. The leech trade was booming. Someone had to collect them. Leech collectors, predominantly poor women, elderly men, and children, waded bare-legged into ponds, marshes, and slow-moving streams. They stood still. They waited. The leeches came to them. When a leech attached, the collector carefully detached it and placed it in a bucket of water. Then they stood still again. The process continued until the bucket was full or the collector's legs gave out. Whichever came first. The consequences of this work were predictable and well documented. Repeated biting caused the legs to become permanently marked. Open wounds in stagnant water became infected. The collector's legs were in a near constant state of damage. Some developed serious infections. Many couldn't walk properly by middle age. And Britain overharvested so badly that wild leech populations began to collapse. Native English leeches became genuinely rare. Leech prices rose. The logical response from the industry was to collect more aggressively, from more remote locations, with more workers. Henry Mayhew, the Victorian journalist who spent years documenting London's underclass for his 1851 work, London Labour and the London Poor, spoke directly to leech collectors. They described working through winter, standing in freezing water, their legs bleeding, filling their buckets, because the money, as bad as it was better than nothing. Medical opinion on bloodletting began to shift in the mid-negative 1800s. By the end of the century, the practice was largely discredited. The leeches outlasted the industry. The collectors had already given up their legs for it. Job number 5. The tanner. Leather was not a luxury item in medieval Europe. It was infrastructure. Boots, saddles, bridles, armor liners, belts, sheaths, water vessels, book bindings, door hinges. Leather was everywhere. And turning raw animal hides into leather required one of the most unpleasant industrial processes in human history. Step 1. Soak the fresh hide in urine. The ammonia loosened the hair and outer skin layers. Workers scraped them off by hand. Step 2. Baiting. The hide was submerged in a solution of animal dung. Specifically, dog feces was preferred because the specific enzymes in dog waste were the most effective at softening the hide. Tanners employed workers called pure collectors whose entire job was walking through city streets collecting dog dung in buckets. The tanners were the ones hiring the pure collectors. Everyone in this supply chain smelled. Step 3. Tanning. The prepared hide was submerged in pits filled with tannic acid, derived from ground oak bark, and left there for months, sometimes a year. Different hides, different tanning times. The tannery at any given moment contained hides at dozens of different stages of preparation, all soaking in their respective pits, all producing their respective smells. The combined odor of a functioning tannery was catastrophic. Medieval European city governments, in London, Paris, Frankfurt, and dozens of other cities, passed ordinances requiring tanners to operate outside city walls. Residents could file legal complaints if a tanner set up too close to inhabited areas. These complaints were taken seriously, and tanners were moved. They were moved, not shut down, because you couldn't shut them down. Every person in medieval Europe needed leather goods. The tanner's work was as essential as the miller's or the smith's. They just had to do it where nobody could smell them. The craft guild system that governed medieval trades maintained tanners as a recognized, established guild with rules, apprenticeships, and standards. It was a skilled trade. It produced a necessary product, and it required working daily with urine, dung, and decomposing animal flesh for years on end. The boots the knights wore to battle, the saddles the lords rode, the covers on the books the monks copied. All of it came from outside the walls. All of it smelled like exactly what it was. Job number 6. The Sin Eater. This one requires a moment. In parts of rural Wales and the English border counties, Herefordshire, Shropshire, and neighboring areas, there existed, from at least the 17th century through the early 20th century, a figure known as the Sin Eater. When a person died, the body would be laid out in the home. Word would be sent for the Sin Eater. The Sin Eater was the poorest, most destitute person available. Someone with no social standing to lose and a desperate need for the small payment the role provided. The Sin Eater would be brought to the body. A piece of bread and a cup of ale would be placed directly on the chest of the corpse. The Sin Eater would eat the bread and drink the ale. By doing so, they ritually absorbed every sin the dead person had accumulated in their lifetime. The community believed this gave the deceased a cleaner passage into the afterlife. Their sins had been transferred. Someone else was carrying them now. That someone was then excommunicated. The Sin Eater could not enter a church, could not take communion, could not participate in the sacraments of the faith that dominated every aspect of life in rural Britain. When they died, they could not be buried in consecrated ground. The churchyard that held everyone they had ever known. They were buried outside the wall. They took on the sins of the dead, one body at a time, from everyone in the community, for their entire lives. The payment in documented cases was a few pence, sometimes 6pence, sometimes a small loaf of bread, in addition to the one eaten during the ritual. John Aubrey, the 17th century antiquarian, documented the practice in his writings on Welsh customs. Later, researchers found it persisting into the 19th century. The last documented Welsh sin eater, a man named Richard Munslow of Ratlinghope, Shropshire, died in 1906. His grave exists. It has been restored by the local community. He was paid 6pence per soul. He carried all of them until he ran out of room. Job number 7. The Whipping Boy. Let's talk about fairness. In the Tudor period in England, the doctrine of the divine right of kings held that monarchs ruled by God's direct authority. The king's person was sacred. To lay hands on the king, even in discipline, was not just disrespectful. It was, in a meaningful sense, theologically problematic. This created an issue. Princes still had to be educated. Education in the 16th century involved memorization, Latin, classical literature, and immediate physical punishment for errors. You got something wrong, you got beaten. That was the system. But you couldn't beat a prince. Solution: assign the prince a companion, a boy of similar age, often of noble but not royal birth, who would be raised alongside him, educated alongside him, and beaten in his place. When the prince made an error in his Latin translation, the whipping boy was beaten. When the prince arrived late to a lesson, the whipping boy was beaten. When the prince misbehaved in any way that would normally earn a flogging, the whipping boy received it. The theory was psychological. The prince would feel such guilt watching his friend and companion suffer for his mistakes that the emotional weight would modify his behavior. The bond between them, a genuine friendship in many cases, was the mechanism. The most documented case is Barnaby Fitzpatrick, who served as whipping boy to the future Edward VI of England. They were close. Letters between them survive from Edward's reign. Barnaby went on to serve as a soldier and diplomat. Edward VI died at 15 of tuberculosis. The whipping boy lived, took all the beatings, watched his friend inherit the throne of England and die young. The position was not considered degrading in the formal sense. Whipping boys were drawn from noble families and were being groomed for court service. But the arrangement was what it was. Someone else's mistakes. You're back. Every time. Job number 8. The plague doctor. You know the image. The long black coat. The beak mask. The wand. The slow walk through streets full of the dying. What the image doesn't tell you. Plague doctors were frequently the least experienced physicians available. The good ones had already left. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and during subsequent outbreaks through the 17th century, established physicians with wealthy clientele and options left. They had practices elsewhere. They had connections. They found reasons not to be in the infected city. The cities that couldn't afford to let everyone die hired whoever would agree to stay. Younger physicians. Physicians who hadn't built a practice yet. Physicians who calculated that the guaranteed salary was worth the risk. The beak mask, filled with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, camphor, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges, wasn't theatrical. It was practical within the prevailing theory of disease. Miasma theory held that illness was transmitted through bad air, specifically the corrupted air rising from decaying matter and sick bodies. The beak was a filter. Stuff it full of good-smelling things. Breathe through those. Hope the bad air doesn't get through. It didn't work, but it wasn't random. It was applied science within an incorrect scientific framework. The plague doctor's toolkit, lancing buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that characterize bubonic plague, bloodletting. Prescribing theriac, a compound medicine with dozens of ingredients that had been the standard treatment for poison and disease since antiquity. Fumigating rooms with herbs. None of it worked against Yersinia pestis. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Between patients, plague doctors were quarantined. They couldn't enter shops or ordinary residences. They were required to announce their presence. Some accounts describe carrying a wand or rattle. They lived separate from the community while trying to serve it. Many died. The ones who survived were rehired immediately because the plague came back and someone had to go. Job number 9. The Tosher. Victorian London produced more sewage than any city in history up to that point. The population exploded from around 1 million in 1,800 to over 6 million by 1,900. The sewer system. The famous brick tunnels beneath the streets, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette after the Great Stink of 1858, was an engineering marvel and a literal maze. The Toshers went into it looking for things to sell. Toshing was the name for sewer scavenging. Toshers crawled through the underground tunnels beneath London's streets with a lantern, a long pole for probing the sludge, and a large apron with deep pockets sewn into it. They were looking for coins that had dropped through street grates, copper fittings that had corroded loose, rope, bones, rags, anything that had washed into the system and could be sold above ground. They worked in gangs of 3 to 5. Safety, mostly. If your lantern went out in the tunnels, you were finished. If a storm broke above and the water surged, you needed people to pull you out. They developed routes. They knew the tunnel system better than the men who built it. The hazards were specific and severe. Methane pockets built up in dead-end tunnels. An open flame in a methane pocket was catastrophic. The water itself was toxic, a combination of sewage, industrial runoff, and the contents of every drain in London. Colonies of rats lived in the tunnels permanently, and they were aggressive in the dark. The police considered Toshers trespassers and thieves. The sewers belonged to the Metropolitan Board of Works. Operating inside them without authorization was illegal. Toshers were arrested when caught. They went back when released. Henry Mayhew spoke to several Toshers for London Labour and the London Poor in 1851. They described it as grueling, dangerous, and the best-paying option available to them. A good day's toshing could earn as much as a skilled tradesperson earned above ground, in the sewers, in the dark, on their knees. Job number 10. The Groom of the Stool. And here we are. The job that sounds, by an enormous margin, like the worst on this list. The Groom of the Stool was a position in the English royal household, specifically the court of the Tudor monarchs, whose official function was to assist the king during defecation. That's not euphemism. That's the job description. The groom brought the basin of water. The groom handed the cloth. The groom assisted the king physically. This sounds like a punishment. It was, in fact, one of the most aggressively sought-after positions at the Tudor court. Here's why. The doctrine of the divine body of the king, combined with the rigid ceremony of the Tudor court, meant that the king was almost never alone. Every public moment was staged. Every meal was ceremony. Every audience was theater. The king was performing kingship every waking hour, except one. The privy was private. No ceremony. No audience. No performance. Just the king, his thoughts, and the person whose job was to be there. The groom of the stool had the king's ear at his most unguarded, most human moment. Things were said in the privy that were never said in the throne room. Requests were made. Confidences were shared. The groom controlled access to the bedchamber, which controlled access to the king's private time, in a court where political power moved entirely. Through personal access to the monarch, the groom of the stool was positioned at the closest possible point. Henry VIII's grooms of the stool included Sir William Compton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Anthony Denny, and Sir Thomas Heneage. These were not minor figures. Denny was one of the most powerful men in England during Henry's final years. He controlled who could enter the king's bedchamber as the king was dying. He was one of 2 men who told Henry VIII that he was about to die. The position was so coveted that noble families lobbied for it. Men with every other form of court access still wanted this one, because this one was different. The job is the grossest on this list. The job was also the best. History keeps doing that. 10 jobs, 10 civilizations, 1 pattern. Every society produces work that needs doing and that nobody wants to do. The Urine Collector in Rome, the Gong Farmer in England, the Ripper Man in Egypt, they existed because something essential required someone to do it, and they were the ones who showed up. What's striking when you look at the list is how clearly the jobs reveal what each civilization valued. Rome valued clean togas and taxed the means of cleaning them. Medieval Europe valued the soul's journey and created a position to absorb its worst baggage. Tudor England valued access to the king and turned even a bathroom into a political arena. And the whipping boy, the sin-eater, the leech collector standing in freezing water. They did the work that nobody else would do. They got paid what nobody else would accept. They went home, to outside the city walls, to the unconsecrated ground at the edge of the churchyard, and they came back the next day. You might think your job is bad. You're probably right. But scale it against a man drowning in a cesspit in 1326 with a candle and a bucket. And maybe your Monday morning doesn't look quite so terrible. Subscribe if you'd like more history that will permanently reframe your complaints about your commute. New video next week.